Hi. So my presentation is going to be a little different. I'm going to be talking about the role of media in covering Ferguson. I'm Emanuele Berry. I work for St. Louis Public Radio. I cover race, culture, and diversity for the station. I have a background in public radio. I've always worked in public radio, luckily. And I just moved to St. Louis in July, so I moved here right before everything happened, and it was crazy. Anyway, still have not made it to the Arch. I've been really busy. So I'm going to take you through a little bit about the role of media in shaping public opinion and influence, how we cover things, as well as kind of give you some insight into how our newsroom worked and how we tried to cover things. So I work, like I said, for St. Louis Public Radio. And for our station, we just went through a merger with an online news staff publication because we want to be able to do radio and online and video and everything, which is kind of what journalism is turning into in a lot of ways, where you have to be able to do everything. So it was a growing newsroom. Our newsroom staff doubled in size just within the past year, thank God. And we are a hyper-local station. So we really try and focus most of our coverage on St. Louis. We're all about that content because there are all these other national media outlets that are talking about other things, so we're really about covering our community and taking stake in our community with our coverage. So we do both radio pieces, like I said. We also do online coverage. So I'm going to take you a little bit into the thinking when Ferguson happened in our newsroom. There was the breaking news, so the constant updates. So our newsroom used a live blog where we were pulling in stuff from Twitter, pulling in stuff from reporters, stories, that sort of thing, to try and give both the most accurate and up-to-date information as quickly as possible. But then we were also really focused on, we wanted to have in-depth pieces that went into background. So I'm going to play a quick piece to kind of give you an example of what I'm talking about. And this is one I did in November, I think.
This morning's news takes us around the world in protest. We'll hear in the next few minutes about acts of protest and the response in Hong Kong, online, and near Ferguson, Missouri. No justice, no football, they were chanting. Protesters outside yesterday's home game for the NFL's St. Louis Rams. It was one of many demonstrations over the weekend calling for justice for Michael Brown, who was shot and killed by police officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson. Last week, the grand jury decision not to indict Wilson caused riots. Yesterday, Ferguson Mayor James Knowles confirmed Wilson has now resigned.
There is no severance agreement with Officer Wilson and the City of Ferguson. Now is the time for the City of Ferguson to begin its healing process.
The mayor announced a new program to recruit more minority police officers. St. Louis Public Radio's Emanuele Berry reports the effort at healing was also taking place in churches across the region.
We thank you, God, for peace on today, God.
Tasha Davis is leading more than 50 people in a prayer under a large white tent in a parking lot just outside Ferguson. Just feet away, the cinder block building that once housed the Flood Christian Church is destroyed, still marked with black ash from a fire set during chaos last Monday evening, the night a grand jury announced its decision not to indict Darren Wilson. Davis says this last week has taken a toll on the congregation.
Emotions are really all over the place. I'm grateful, I'm thankful, I'm sad, because I understand that it could have been worse.
Davis says authorities are currently investigating the fire, trying to give both that quick, up-to-date information, but actually take the time to share these more personal stories. So that's what we were really aiming for in our coverage. We also, I was going to show you the sheer volume of stories that we've done on this topic. The whole newsroom kind of turned into a 24-hour newsroom where everybody was working on this. But I mean, this is 3 months of work that just keeps going. Anyway, so in covering Ferguson, we're talking about covering disparities, we're talking about covering minority communities. And that's not something that journalism or media has traditionally done very well. When including my station in some ways, including all stations, I think, in general. We're a lot more comfortable doing stories about communities kind of from a further away distance, even if we do, without directly engaging in them. So this event for a lot of people forced them to, I guess, analyze their own coverage, as well as it forced them to share these different voices that we don't typically hear in the media. So in shaping opinions, I mean, media plays a huge role in the overall narrative of Ferguson and what was being dispersed publicly. If you look back kind of at, I think Selma is a good example, not that this is in any way the same as the civil rights movement in the 60s, there are ties, but I think that's a good example of the role of media and how, in a way, it helps bring attention to these issues and really it's what gets the public's attention. Without it, that information isn't shared, that powerful narrative isn't shared. Another positive thing that came out of it, these are all people who I got to interview. All of these are different voices that might not have necessarily been shared if not for the media's presence. But then, once again, the media shapes because I chose to talk to these people versus other people. So there's that as well. Let's see. So in shaping the narrative, as media does, we also get things wrong. And while Ferguson allowed us to share different stories, I think it also raised a lot of questions about the way that we share stories and how we represent things. So this is a picture of a street in Ferguson. This is West Florissant. And as you can see, there are like media trucks and tents in this parking lot over here, and it looks a little bit like a circus, and that's because it was a circus. It got to this point where there were journalists from all over the world. There were French journalists and British journalists and people coming from everywhere, and everyone's trying to get a story because their paper sent them there, their TV station sent them there, and they're like stuck in Ferguson, Missouri for 2 weeks, and they have to have a story. So that puts a different kind of pressure and changes the way that you tell stories, I think. And it creates, in a way, forced narratives. So this is kind of one of my criticisms of the media as a whole in looking back at the way that Ferguson was covered. And I think a really good example, or someone who explains it really well, their feelings about Ferguson and media's role is Nigel Dowa. He's a former AP reporter. And he wrote this piece for the Humanities Review in Oregon, and it's called "We Went to Ferguson to Find a Story, Even if We Had to Make It Ourselves." And I'm going to do what you're not supposed to do when you have PowerPoint presentations and read you a long paragraph. So it says, "We spent our days in St. Louis City and the surrounding county looking for witnesses or autopsy reports or which politician was flying in next. But without fail, each evening we found ourselves back behind the yellow tape in a crowd waiting for the show. And a show is what it had become in Ferguson, Missouri, in the weeks after an unarmed black 18-year-old was shot and killed by a white police officer in a city where most of the cops are white and most of the residents are black. Maybe that's what it was in the beginning. Protesters south, cops north. Sometimes the police would push in from farther south, trapping the protesters between lines. This had the potential to be civil rights history. That essentially is why we, the media, were there. From either coast, we came to see firsthand what we'd previously seen only in black and white images from the 1960s. Protesters versus police, a changing nation, a single moment in a national shouting argument about race. At first blush, the right elements were there. A city racked by racial discord, white flight, and redlining. Aggressive police policies, clusters of protesters, more ready to loot than march. If the reminders of the 1960s weren't clear enough, at one point a CNN international news anchor even asked why police didn't clear the protesters with a hose. So that kind of gets at the idea that this is, all these people are here, all these people need a story. It turns into sort of this routine. And then he goes on later to say, each night we covered an event. Some of us waited at the command center, or in the cornered off media staging area in a fast food parking lot. The rest were in the crowd, following protesters up and down fluorescent, jamming cameras or recorders in their faces, walking backwards like campus tour guides. Listen, and you'll hear us in the background of most of the interviews from protesters. Watch your back, tripping to each other to avoid cracks in the sidewalk. A clump of police in riot gear, sullen protesters looking for a fight. Since we didn't have the boundaries we were used to, we created them. The nominal theater of West Florissant, but in truth, it was broader than that. It was an arena in the minds of the men and women on the street, each side wearing their respective uniforms, created by people who followed the Ferguson hashtag or who donated to a fund set up for Darren Wilson, the officer who killed Brown. Two sides, a boundary, ticking clock. We were back to the news normalcy. At some point, I began to question whether we were doing more harm than good. We had a duty to be there. This much was clear. Who knows what either side might have done with the cameras off. But the arena we created by being present is different than one constructed by a few local TV cameramen and one harried print reporter trying to capture video with a phone in her right hand while tweeting with the one in the left. The arena is one which even the slightest turn of screw makes news, where a single arrest in broad daylight on an otherwise unremarkable street is broadcast to the world. I think that gives a really good sense of the way that media, in this case, shaped that narrative. And I don't necessarily agree with everything that was said there, but it captures this idea that Ferguson, it's not saying that that the media made things up. Everything that was reported are things that happened. Cops did things that they weren't supposed to do, protesters did things that they wouldn't do, but media definitely shaped what that narrative became by kind of the overwhelming presence. So I think that the takeaway from that, for me, and I think for you as an audience of media and a consumer of media, is this idea that when you're a reader or a listener or watcher, that you have to be a cautious consumer of the media that you're taking in. Whether that's because the media you're taking in isn't providing enough diverse opinions, whether that's because the media you're taking in is creating a story in a way. And I also wanted to, I guess more than anything, it's about finding media that you trust, and that's providing content that is quality over quantity. And I think that's some of what we ended up with in the coverage of Ferguson. I also briefly wanted to talk about the role of social media in Ferguson, because it also played a huge role. I think it got to the point where a lot of false information was going out on social media, and people kind of were becoming their own reporters, which is great in a way, but I think it also goes back to the idea of the importance in journalism and covering an event like this, because we are trained to get facts. We are supposed to be on the sidelines. We are supposed to be observers. So although it played a huge role, I also think that traditional media is still really important in covering things like this. Yeah, so that's all that I have. Thank you.